So I think I'm here. Okay, this is Sam Droege. I work at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. I look at how to best count things that don't want to be counted, animals, plants. I've done many different kinds of groups over the years. Right now, though, we have spent the past couple decades, I've been around for a long time, working on how to count native bees, among a few other projects. So I want to talk about today is I want to talk about the relationship between native bees, which not many people know about. So this will be a slight introduction to that group, and what you might be doing in the property you own, which might be just your backyard, and give you a little flavor of that. It's a big topic, right? So we have bees that co-evolved all the flowering plants. So every flower you see has a relationship to some set of bees that occurred many years ago. You know about flowers, you know about all these different kinds of floral sizes and shapes, and we're going to get into that. There's a matching and equally as complicated set of bees. There's not just the honeybee. So I'm going to click off my video and try and get the slideshow going here. With the, where is it? That looks like it there. And now if I click that, do I get the full screen? Maybe I do. Maybe we're too far down the whole talk. So now you saw everything. Okay, so here's contact information. This is going to show up again. I've put my contact information in the chat box, which right now I can't see. And at the end of the talk, we can take some questions. You can certainly, though, email me with questions if we run out of time. Okay, so I want to get here. So as I mentioned in the introduction, your yard makes a difference. So remember, bees are very tiny. It's not like you're going to reintroduce bison or elk or wolves into your backyard. A bee is the perfect size to think about in terms of creating a wildlife refuge, a habitat, a return to the native habitats that were once there before your yard came in. So a little context, here's the Washington, D.C. area. What I want you to think about is that your house, your property, the place you live, the place you work, sits within a matrix of thousands and thousands. Do I have a slide of this? I do. You know, for Maryland, we have about 450 kinds of bee species documented, but almost 4,000 different plants. This area has a biodiversity with lots of endemism. So it's not all in some foreign country or way off in a national park. You're sitting right inside an area that is equal and equally rich in numbers and kinds of plants and relationships and plants and animals and all those sorts of things that we're interested in, and have many of which have conservation issues because the naturalized landscapes that they lived in have been eaten up by agriculture and people's anthropogenic kinds of activities, houses, roads, places they live, mowed verges on roads, those kinds of things. So we need to think about things. So one of the things to think about is like, okay, we've taken all that complexity, we come in with a large earth moving machine, completely destroy the soil matrix within that area, we flatten and we put one species of plant in there. If that doesn't strike you as just wrong, I just don't know what you're thinking about, because we've erased everything and replaced it with something that we have to spend a lot of time, money, and effort to maintain in such a beautiful kind of context. So, and I noticed that they still have, a couple leaves on here. So it's imperfect. It's always going to be imperfect. And this provides no real benefit to any of the wildlife, and has almost no benefit and a lot of negatives because the inputs of pesticides, fertilizers, and other things to the ecosystem in the area. It's a cultural artifact. It's a cultural thing that we desire to have. I want you to shift to look at these kinds of things, as I do, as something that needs to be replaced, something that is a negative. Yards, lawn have their places for playgrounds, but in most places in America, we don't even go outside very much. So let alone needing all this lawn space or keeping up with the neighbors. So there's ways to do this. This is more towards what we're looking at. So Manassas National Battlefield, moving towards naturalized landscapes. You won't be working at this scale, but you can think of your yard as a place where a more complex mix of plants, or at least some pollinator-friendly plants, can exist that will be supporting bees and other insects, not the opposite, which is largely what lawns do. Even if you have a junky lawn, it's still filled with weeds and provides relatively little benefits. But I should point out, if you do have a lawn and you need to have a lawn, better to have a weedy lawn than the pure maintained artificial sorts of lawn. Before we get into all the information about bees and other things, we need to talk about honeybees. So this is the bee that people know about. It's culturally embedded within our society. We know tons about honeybees. We've used them for years as food sources and as for pollination, sort of. So I don't have time, and that's not the purpose of this talk, but within the region, we don't need to have honeybees for our pollination services. The wild bees in the area provide that for us already. So honeybees are not native to even this hemisphere. So there's reasons to have honeybees, similar that there are reasons to have any other kinds of animal that we have domesticated in our lives. We prefer them, we like them, they're important. If you have them because you think you're helping the world out, then you should take a good look at that, because they are competitors with the wild bees and they're not providing a service to the ecosystem. They do provide you honey. You're not going to get that from honeybees, but are from our native bees, but you can also go to the store and buy honey. So, and additionally, they're radically different from the native bees in terms of their life histories. So their life histories are well known, like hives, queens, multi-year lives, swarms, honeycomb, barb stings, allergic reactions. None of that occurs within our native bee species. So you need to think about everything you know about bees. If it's about honeybees, you need to now erase that. We won't have time to get into all these equally detailed facets of the native bees, which have a diversity of lifestyles too, just like the honeybee. Just to say, honeybees are really, really different. Very cool from their perspective, but not a good model to think about what we're going to talk about next. So I'm just going to go through a set of some of the local wildflowers. All I want you to do here is look at all the sizes and shapes of these flowers, all these differences, the colors, and you can think about times of year. What's going on here? Well, the answer is that those sizes and shapes, and I should say, just backing up here a second, all the pictures you see here are taken in our lab. Helen Lowe Metzman is the person that did the pictures of the flowers, and different people, volunteers and interns and myself do the bee pictures. These are all publicly available via that Flickr site that was mentioned before. And we have Instagram and not Twitter, but Tumblr sites where we go into and blog about lots of detailed information. That is not going to be presented here about each of these species. They're public domain. You can absolutely do whatever you want with them. You can download them and print them out, modify them, use them. We're great with all that. Don't ask us, because we're going to say yes. So back to these bees. So these bees have co-designed those flowers. All those different size, shapes, and colors of flowers have meaning to these bees. Otherwise, there'd be the bee and the flower, but there's not. The sizes and shapes, most bees, for example, are tiny, about the size of a grain of rice, plus or minus a little bit. Honeybee is a whopping big bee. Bumblebees are monsters. So the rest of the bees, those 450, small in comparison. Look at the tongue architecture here. Particularly, you're at Balticon, like what a fantastic monster looking thing. Just look at all the different features on those things that we call tongues as an example. You can also look at many of the other features of this creature we call bee and just enjoy how fantastically different it is from vertebrates, right? Wings as an example, all the kinds of structural elements of those wings. Look at all the pollen carrying features. Look at all the features that the bee has that we don't have time to talk about, that are about grooming themselves, moving the pollen to areas on their bodies that they store. All these kinds of sizes and shapes have meaning, but meaning in relationship to what the flowers they service and use, and how they relate to individual groups of flowers, which are often highly specialized. So, and also just enjoy at least I enjoy this, that you have just as much beauty and symmetry, and the palette of colors is also just as expressive in bees as it is in the plants that they are pollinating. You just don't see them because our eyes don't resolve this level of detail. And that's one of the fun things about having all these photos and sharing them with people, is that they it's delightful to see how different these bees are once you can see them. Here, for example, is a cactus bee carrying its pollen, not on its legs, but under its abdomen, and only collecting it from prickly pear cactus. Look at the tongue shape. Here's one that has just a shorter forked tongue, more for lapping, not for inserting into those deep corollas. Here's one with big bushy legs in the back here for carrying pollen dry. Honeybees and bumblebees carry that pollen wet. Here's another one that has just finished collecting some of its pollen. It basically is carrying the pollen throughout its body. That's why bees are hairy. And then going to deposit it there. Okay, now we're going to move into looking at the relationship between these plants and bees. And my emphasis here is going to be that you know way more about plants than you know about these bee species. These bee species, in some cases, we don't even have names for them. We're that far behind in terms of understanding of the different native bee species, but we do know a lot about plants. And the message here is going to be basically flowering native plants, and you'll be supporting some segment of the native bee population. If you want, you can see some of the work that we do and get a little more involved and learn what those relationships are. But basically, my message to you is don't worry about all the different names of these bees. In fact, I'm not even giving you any, am I? I'm going to ask you to think about what can you do for these bees, which is going to be about planting them, and then some notions that you can then look at the different bee species and enjoy them when you are looking at the flowers that you've created. So all bees use pollen and are obligate pollen feeders somewhere in their life cycle, usually feeding their young, almost entirely feeding their young. Here, for example, is Halictus legatus, has covered with sunflower pollen. It's going to deposit that pollen in its nest, mix it with nectar, lay an egg on it, close that off, walk away, and then the following year that bee will hatch out and the cycle will begin again. Okay, so on the ground kinds of things. Here's a pollinator garden. I'm air quoting that. It's pretty nice. It's in downtown DC, and I think you can see my cursor here, but you look here, this is lantana. It's mostly a nectar source. It's not native to the region. It really does attract bees, but it doesn't support them very well because the pollen is almost never used. And a lot of times the people who develop lantana varieties, they mess around with it so much that the pollen and nectar dwindle in these cultivated things. We can look at several of these other groups in a similar way. Here's crepe myrtle, mostly doesn't attract things anymore because it's so highly derived. Back here, look, here's some native sunflowers that have been planted. Those probably still do. And several, we could continue to kind of go through these plants and look at supporting. So the trick here is, this is complicated. Like, how and what does lantana support? Well, who knows? That's just something that people aren't going to look up. Again, if you largely just plant native plants, you're going to be doing that support activity. Flowers to avoid in a very general way would be highly derived ones. So these are the kinds of things you find most often in big box stores. These are the super tough plants that have been developed to withstand the average homeowner's abuse. So they flower for a long time. They provide a lot of color. They don't grow too tall. They don't flop over. All kinds of variables such as size, color, length of bloom, hardiness, and a lot of times the energy that the plant uses to do what is now being an evolution by humans comes from the pollen and nectar. And so most of these plants have little to no pollen and nectar left to give. It's all just color. And then hybrids, same problem. doubles. When you double things, then you're modifying some of the sexual parts of the plant to give you more color and bloom. So in general, you want to avoid, even if you're buying non-native plants, things that have been like derived or overbred to be fancy schmancy, to be technical about it. Okay, so there's a set of bees that are generalist bees. They use many plants. They're out all throughout the year. They're often abundant because they build up their populations. Here's a good example. This is in your garden. You may not be aware of this, but this was taken from a tomato plant in Laurel, Maryland, just in suburban backyard. You have to look closely and you'll notice that a lot of those bees are metallic green color, just like this. As an aside, here's an interesting, funny story. This is Algochloropsis metallica. And when we started putting up these pictures, we thought we were just, feeding the needs of other bee heads who were doing identifications, and it was about having an online museum. But they were on Flickr, and turns out other people look at them. And then all of a sudden we noticed that this picture was getting tons of hits. And we realized that people were doing searches on Metallica, seeing this pop up, and then staying. And then they would start looking at our other bee pictures. And so it made us realize, as is several other good, interesting stories I could tell, that these pictures of bees have legs in terms of attracting people's attention. And we now have very large followings on Instagram and Tumblr, in addition to the high use on Flickr. So again, it's something that was a nice surprise. Metallica, who knew? Many bees, though, are highly specialized. So about 40% of the bees that use pollen, 20% of bees actually are parasites on other bees, so we're ignoring those for now. But of those that carry pollen, 40% or so are highly specialized. They are taking the pollen only from one species of plant or small groups of plants. Here, for example, on the left is Osmia texana. It's a big spring or late spring bee, metallic blue in a way, and it feeds only on thistle plants of different kinds. So if you want that bee, you have to have that plant. So I put this link in the chat section so you can copy and paste it from there. But we have compiled those relationships into sort of a very dry set of tables. But on the right-hand side here, you can see the flowers, and there's links to where you buy those flowers and the common names there too. And these flowers are often, they're usually common plants, right? Because you aren't going to develop a specialized relationship between bee and flower if one or the other of them is super rare, right? So these are common things: solidagos, goldenrods, this is aster, these are mustards, this is willow. Anyway, that gives you some idea of a first on the list things to plant and to encourage within whatever landscape you have. So as another aside, when you start thinking about, well, I'm going to put in these plants that'll attract bees and then everyone's going to get stung. So bees don't defend flowers, they only defend their nests, and only honeybees and a few of the bumblebee species actually defend their nests by some kind of stinging attack. And about a quarter of all of our native species physically cannot sting us because their sting is so wimpy that it can't even penetrate our hands. And they're almost all solitary moms. So if you come by their nest, and you do, like every single yard is filled with bee nests. They're small, they're single holes done by single mom bees, nesting in the ground because that's the primary MO of bees. And they don't, you step on it or near it, they're just sitting tight, or they're flying away. They don't defend it because why would they? They're just going to get killed. Something like a honeybee, though, does, because they have thousands of workers who aren't reproductive and they're weaponized. That's why their venom hurts. They have barbed stings to continue pumping that venom. And that's why we are allergic to honeybee venom, because they want to take us down. And we're not allergic to any of the other bee venom. Some of the bees can sting, like bumblebees certainly sting, and their sting is painful, but it's not sending to the hospital. It's only the honeybee group that has that particular capability. And that's only because they're very special, right? They have large, large colonies, often with thousands of members in them, and they're defending their mom, the queen. Okay, try not to get too into the weeds, so to speak. A good place to visit if you want to see a group that has done a lot with native plants, particularly shade-tolerant plants, as many yards in the area have shade, would be to visit Mount Cuba in northern Delaware. They're open for visits. Matt Sarver did some collecting there on some of their plants that they had planted. They have large expanses of native plants and found a whole series of these specialized bees that in some cases weren't even known from the surrounding states. In many cases were new for Delaware. So you plant it and these bees will come. Um, and I should also point out that this is a shot of a series of birds that died by hitting buildings, another cost of our building out things in migration in Washington, D.C. on a little transect. But that diversity of birds, that could be in your yard too. And it's kind of ironic that people remove everything in the area, then put in a lawn and then put up a bird feeder, right? Because they want to attract birds. They're not really supporting them. They're just attracting them because they're kind of cool, but they, at the same time, they've completely ruined their environment. So if you plant your yard back with any kind of significant sort of plantings for bees, those plants are going to produce seed and provide cover for birds, and you automatically will be supporting those birds. I pass over the slide right at the beginning without commenting, but a point I want, which was a slide of a whole bunch of different kinds of insects and spiders and things, to say that when we talk about providing native plants for bees, we're really providing native plants that support a large variety of insects and fungi and things that are endemic to the region. You have to have, tall ironweed to have a long list of insect and plant species and fungal and bacterial species that only use that plant. And so by planting back native plants, you're actually supporting a whole community, a whole system of plants and animals, and they're there for you to enjoy. So this is your way of giving back. And so it's not just about bees. So when you plant for bees, though, you're providing things for all kinds of stuff. Even little weedy things, some of these are native, like ground cherry or physalis. They have that little puffball of a seed pod that you see over here. And here's one of the specialists. They have a set of bees that only go to ground cherry, yet we consider the ground cherry to be basically a weed, but they're actually cute in their own way. I'm just giving you some examples. So I could go on for a couple of weeks on all the information about what we know about a lot of these different bee species because it's so varied. But we have different bees that come out only when the goldenrods start to bloom. We think sometimes, I think people think of goldenrods as one, a weed, and two, giving you allergies. And I'll just point out that any plant that has a colorful flower is not giving you allergies because it's trying to attract bees. So color, just think of reds, blues, and whites in those flowers. Those don't occur in nature, right? The nature just makes things green because it's reflecting back the green colors and the rest are the light waves are used for production of energy for green living things. And the rest are kind of pastels, right? The colors of earth, bark, whatever. There's no need for blue, yellow, and white. That's why flowers are those colors. They're signals. And so when you see a plant that is putting out some flowery thing, it's trying to attract insects. And that means it's not just throwing out its pollen willy-nilly like pines and ragweed and grasses do, which is what we're allergic to. So anything that's colorful, not an allergy problem, and is always going to be a benefit of some kind to insects and to bees. So goldenrods have specialist bees on them. Willow, which is an interesting one, it is sort of goes against the thing because this is a basically boring, non-flowering flower. But if you think about it, willow forms these dense communities along wetlands, and they're there for decades, if not centuries, and they build up their own population of specialized bees that only go to these willow plants. And it's very regular. They don't have to look far. They don't have to spend a lot of time discovering them like some of the other perennials and annuals do, which put out big signals, i.e. flowers. in here. So here's my exception already. So willow, particularly the shrubby ones in your yard, are a lovely addition to your garden, particularly if you have a wet spot somewhere. Here's another cool thing. So a lot of our morning glories are related to European and Asian species that are not native and don't support much, but we do have a set of native morning glories. Here's one of them, the lovely Ipomaea pandurata, man of the earth, big white blooms. You can buy the seeds in different places. And it supports this baby, Cimolobus Ipomaea, which I always think of as like a little elf person on here riding the Cimolobus off into the distance. I keep forgetting what audience I'm going to. They might be of interest. Like, wouldn't that be cool if you had a steed that looked like that rather than some horrible dragon or something? I'm slaying the dragon right here. That's probably not something I should be doing. Okay, so sunflowers, there's the annual sunflower, good. But the perennial sunflowers, of which we have a whole variety of, are even better, and they also come up every year and provide longer term pollen and nectar sources, and you don't have to futz around with them as much. You don't have to plant them every year. And they have a whole series of different bees that are only going to sunflowers. We talked about thistles already. I just love thistles. So here's another couple of thistle bees. And also my favorite thistle, Cirsium horridulum, which is hard to get a hold of, but occurs like on the sandy soils on the eastern shore, like Causeway to Ocean City, for example, has this. And it should be blooming in another 3 weeks, I'd say, out there. Ironweeds, another in the aster family, has its own fast-flying bee. It's an easy one to plant. If you plant it, you will get this bee coming to it. I've seen these planted on the National Mall, which is of course not surrounded by great habitat of any kind, and this bee is merrily picking up pollen from those plants and nesting in the ground surrounding it somewhere there on the National Mall. Frost asters, again, we think of these big white aster blooms as weedy, but they're supporting tons of bees. And the thing about asters is they can handle very disturbed, very difficult to grow in sites that a lot of the more dainty native plants can't deal with. So encouraging asters in roadsides and waste areas and highly disturbed with lousy soil things, that's the way to go, because it's producing tons and tons of pollen and nectar, as do goldenrods, also thrive in those environments. And there's several other species we don't have time to talk about, and you'll get things like Andrena asteroides coming into the plants. Blooming shrubs are another entire group that have lots of specialists. So things like the ericaceous shrubs. Ericaceous shrubs would be the heath plants, heath family. So cranberry, blueberry, mountain laurel, and then there's Lionia. There's a longer list. They have their own sets of specialists that come to them. Devil's walking stick is a lovely thing to add to your garden. It has a giant 2 foot across to 3 foot across lollipop of flowers later in the year and lovely big thorns. Ceanothus chinkapin has its own, it's basically a small chestnut, has its own set of plants. Shadbush is another. There are many, some of which have specialists, some of which are just glorious in what they attract. So here's an example of azaleas. So this group over here, these sort of fluorescent colored ones, mostly are Himalayan hybrids. So they're derived, they're highly, messed around with by people. And they do get a few bees, but not very many. But we have our own set of native, usually larger flowering, more on the rhododendron side of things, set of azaleas and rhododendrons that attract their own set of specialized bees. So even within groups, you have to be a little more careful about and discerning. Here's a list. I can afterwards try and dump this into the chat thing. These are just some of my favorite plants that I love planting in gardens because they provide lots to look at. So mountain mint, for example, super tough, deer won't touch it. It forms this lovely sort of 2.5 foot tall plane of bloom that blooms for quite a long period of time, providing the perfect platform to watch bees and wasps and other insects come and go on there. As an aside, you might think about getting the Pentax butterfly binocular. It focuses down to 18 inches at 8 power. You can see all sorts of action with that baby. Only costs a little more than $100. You can also look at birds with it too. So figwort is another plant hard to get a hold of. It's actually relatively easy to grow. Oh my God, such a wonderful bee plant. The shrub hollies, the American holly is good too, but big. The shrub hollies, winterberry and its kin are awesome. We have wild plum. These are essentially in the same group as our fruits. So wild plum, and we have our derived plums, apples. We have native crab apples, and I should point out that in general, the fruits and berries are big supporters of native bees too, because those fruits and berries, even if some came from Europe, are very closely related to our native fruits and berries, and sometimes they're derived from our native fruits and berries. But the growers and developers of those varieties aren't touching the pollen and nectar in those plants because they are needed to create, obviously, the fruits. So having a fruit tree is actually a big plus. Native crabs, even better. But you can go through like blackberries and other things too. Cup plant, germander, all the vacciniums, and down this list. And zinnias, not native to this area, but they are in Mexico and the southwest, are just something that are easy to grow and, good filler-ins of color and sort of a 7-Eleven of nectar for lots of things, including butterflies. More examples of super specialized situations. Evening primroses. We've got a bunch of species. Why do they bloom only in the evening? Well, it's because the bees that specialize on evening primrose, they only come out in the evening. So thus the evening primrose has gotten out of being blooming when you have all these other potential bees, wasps, and other insects that would steal your pollen and nectar, because a plant has spent a lot of plant money developing pollen that is coated with all kinds of fats and lipids and other things that bees would feed their young, not because it's of direct benefit to the plant, but if you don't have yummy pollen, then no bee is going to visit it. But the problem is you have other things that would steal your pollen and nectar. So their MO is like, okay, I've got all this good stuff, but I'm going to open up in the evening and only when my favorite bees are around. Lots of stories like that. Morning glory, opposite thing. Those bees that I showed you, the Cimolobus ipomea comes out before dawn. That's when the morning glories start to open. And that's why they open that early. So something to think about when you think about your yard. How many bees, how many flowers, what does this plant, how much of it is supporting? Very roughly, every 5 flowers is enough pollen and nectar to support the raising of one baby bee. So a single clump of perennials is a significant addition to your yard support list for bees. And when you fill your yard with flowers, you're supporting literally hundreds of bees when you do those kinds of things. So at minimum, don't deflect off your responsibility to help the environment by saying that, oh, I just don't have enough space, or I only have this one little bedding area. Yeah, you even have a pot area you can add. The bees will nest somewhere else, but you can provide some pollen and nectar in pretty much any environment. Maybe not if you are completely in the middle of an apartment complex. But even there's opportunity. So get back to this. Having a diversity of native plants is going to yield a diversity of native bees. All those factors that go into it are going to be complicating, but you don't need to know that. You just want bloom throughout this time period. Okay, a couple examples. Baltimore Harbor. It is not the place you would go or think about in terms of bees and the support of bees, but to show you how tough bees are, you look at this area, and we did a 1.5-day survey And we found, I'll show you the slide in a second, about 50 species in July, which is the low ebb for bees during the year, kinds of bees being out. And what you have is you have all these old abandoned wharves and all kinds of industrial areas, and there's tons of weedy stuff. So they're basically mostly crow and sparrow bees with a couple odd examples. This is a trap that we put out in with local architecture around there. And very interesting people to talk to. But the key here is how many bees were there in this very altered environment. Similarly, Sidwell Friends School, sort of the opposite end of the cultural spectrum, is in the middle of Georgetown in Washington, D.C. area. It is not near a park. It is surrounded by highly modified habitat, though, but they have lots and lots of plantings. You know, people are maintaining gardens of different kinds. Sidwell Friends School, not so good. You know, they don't have much in the way of plants there. But the kids, for a series of years, have been putting out traps and trapping bees with, you know, and then I would identify them, 85 species just in this area. And I'm sure they would find more if they actually worked through the summer. But every place has about 100 species of bees available to them. But whether the bees stop and hang out at your yard is up to you in terms of what you plant. So just urban bees in general, most of these bees are nesting in the ground. You can augment their numbers by, as we talked about, plantings, but you can also drill holes in wood. So there's a series of bees that nest in wood or in hollow stems of plants. It doesn't have to be something you purchase. Just take a drill, you know, a portable drill with a different size drill bits and give it to a child and just tell them, drill whatever you want, you know, drill the neighbor's fence or the porch, you know, any piece of wood, the wood pile, and then bees will nest in it. So they're not picky. You can make it as fancy or not fancy as you want. Do a Google search on bee hotels, and you'll see all kinds of creative ways to do stuff with holes. You can also leave bare ground. So there's a set of bees that love hard-packed dirt or just loose soil with no or little plants on it. We tend not to do that, but in the back corner of your yard, if you have a cut bank or some other place, a pile of dirt, leave it. That's good for bee nesting. When you, at the end of the year, you know, when you're tidying up your garden, cut all the stems to 1 foot high. Don't cut them to the ground. Don't leave them up. Bees have a hard time cutting through the outside of the plant stems. You actually help them by cutting them to 1 foot, and your neighbors appreciate that you're keeping things neat and tidy. You can also take those cut stems, particularly Phragmites, which of course are not in your yard, but Phragmites stems cut into bundles and then cut up like into foot lengths. Don't need to spend a lot of time cutting them exactly on the nodes. The bees will figure it out. Great way to attract a bunch of bees to nest. Same thing with the pithy stems and cuttings of your old blackberries and elderberries. And you can buy these things too. Bumblebees, something that people are more concerned about, have their own set of issues of introduced diseases right now. Key is in the spring, the very early spring, the queens wake up. They've been sitting underground using their fat stores to make it through the winter. They're hungry when they come out. So they're looking for some bloom. Anything that blooms super early in the spring is going to help your bumblebees establish their colonies. I even am a promoter if you do have a lawn that you should have a really weedy lawn filled with all those like purple dead nettle and gill over the ground kinds of mints that annoy me mightily when they're in the garden, but they provide early bloom, and there's several other native plants that also provide that early bloom, mostly in the woodlands, that help the bumblebees get going, get the queen off the ground so that she can build up her colony to really thrive in the middle of the summer. Additionally, for bumblebees, heavy bloom in mid to late summer, that's when they're producing their next year's crop of females and males. Males mate and don't make it through the winter. Females are the queens, make it through the winter. Mints in general, good supporters of bumblebees. Clovers and legumes, particularly the wild beans. Clovers are good, not really native to the region. Redbud is a great leguminous shrubby thing. Horse nettle which is a weed that most people despise, is native, and bumblebees love horse nettle. So don't be so quick if you have an area that you can leave behind. Allow some of those horse nettles to remain in bloom. Thistles, like we talked about, be sure to not do bull thistle and Canada thistle, which are non-native and invasive, but are native thistles. Then we have goldenrods, perennial sunflowers, and if you see someone trying to sell you nest boxes for bumblebees, don't buy them. They don't work. Okay, so we're drilling down. We're almost done here. I just want to point out that most yards, and I have an acre, you don't really need to have a lawnmower. So get a really good quality weed whacker, and get one that you can swap out the string trimmer at the end with a brush blade. It's basically a rotating blade. I like the 4-blade one the best. A lot of these good quality string trimmers handle these brush blades, and you can use that in conjunction with your string trimmer to edit your yard. So the string trimmer maintains a series of paths and small open areas of lawn that are still useful to you. And then the rest of the area is managed with the combination of string trimmer and sometimes the brush blade, particularly at the end of the year, to knock out any plants, invasives, things you don't want, things you want to cut back in your garden. And I give talks about this, but it's the way to go. And it's surprisingly fast, uses very little gas. This Makita here, and I think some of the others, but I'm not sure, is a 4-stroke, meaning it's using just gas, not an oil gas mix. Pollution is less. I'm a complete convert now for using this to maintain yards, and I've used that now to maintain the 30 acres that we have here at Patuxent. And it's fun. So here is example. I'm standing on my roof. I'm looking at my guest house. I'm maintaining small paths throughout these areas, and then patches of naturalized grasses and flowers, most of which are at the end of the cycle right now. And I just come in, and if there's too many, like these Monarda are spreading out, I can knock them back with the weed whack. I can trim out some of the blackberries. And I'm constantly using this to sculpt and shape the landscape. I can use the bigger blades to cut out the woody vegetation in the back if I need to. I'm really, it's really a game changer, because who wants to weed? Like if you're in a naturalized landscape, who wants to go in here and individually cut out plants? But you still, if you don't, you're going to run into problems of things getting overgrown, or too many invasives that will create their own invasive lawn. So the key to these kinds of things, to any kind of naturalized planting and heavy duty plantings, is not to just let your yard go. Okay, so that's fine. That actually is a positive, but not to your neighbors. And so what's going to happen is they will mow your lawn, so to speak, when you're gone, or they will, send the lawn cops out and give you a citation. The key is to maintain, after all, you have a string trimmer, a really tight lawn area around, with bedding plants around your house, and any kind of walkway, any kind of sidewalk in the front, your driveway, fences with the neighbors, to be very pristine in terms of its presentation. And then you can run paths throughout the rest of the area. As long as you do the edges of your yard really neatly, then you've achieved what the neighbors want. People look at it, they know you did whatever you did there, you did on purpose. And so you've checked that box for the neighborhood. They don't know what you're doing here per se, but it's okay, because you're doing a good job of neat and tidying things up. On the flip side, two things. First of all, 5% of all pollution comes from lawn equipment in the United States, air pollution that is, and that when you're mowing things, if you're mowing down flowers that are occurring in a field or a situation like this, count the number of flowers you mowed down, divide by 5, and that's the number of baby bees you've killed. So there, I've just given you a little guilt to think about. If you have a larger property, this is, I think, the next to last slide. The basic theme here is to mow. If you don't know anything else to do, just mow it once a year. You don't really want a lot of these areas to go back to woodlands, or to worse is crappy woodlands, because we have plenty of that right now. We could use more, obviously, but we put houses everywhere. What we're missing are these field open transitional habitats that we don't generate anymore. So it takes a little more work to keep a place in a pasture, but that's where our key conservation action is for bees and many other species, is maintaining these open field related flowering plants and the systems like the meadows where they occur. Okay, here's my last slide. I'm done. This is my contact information. I encourage people to follow us on our Instagram, Tumblr, and we have a Facebook group too. Then, and that at USGS BIML is the, is our whatever that's called thing. Okay, I'm done. So I'm going to stop sharing, I think. Is that the right thing to do? And look at the questions. I'm going to look at questions and answers first. The host has asked you to start your video. Okay, I'm doing that. There we are. All right. Let's see. I'll just randomly start. You can email me if we run out of time, and the host may kick me off this whole thing because I'm not paying attention to what's going on. Okay, I just wanted to ask if it's okay for me to use a snapshot from the preset for my blog. Yeah, totally. British have a program labeling certain flower seed packets as bee friendly, including other pollinators, butterflies. Is there a similar US marketing? There's nothing that's consistent. So there's no group like USDA or anything putting that label. So when you see things that are about pollinators, what's going on, it could be anything. Like a lot of these pollinator wildflower mixes are a bunch of easy to grow, toss off seeds that the seed companies can put together quickly. They tend to be annuals. They're not bad. I use them as filler for places that I have nothing else. And I usually don't try to seed them in. That's a poor strategy in general. Best is to get some flats, fill it with potting soil, start your wildflower mixes in there, and then transplant them into a bed after you plow it up. Whenever you plow a suburban area or urban or a lot of these areas, your weed seeds are ready to go. You have thousands more weed seeds than you have whatever you're trying to plant in there. And that's it. So most of these wildflower mixes don't work well unless you're, planting at scale, at large scales. Okay. Is the ground cherry, aka mayapple, two different things. Mayapple, more woodland, spring. It has its own set of pollinators, good for bumblebees. Ground cherry is physalis, and you'll have to look it up. There's a commercial ground cherry. So tomatillo is a type of ground cherry. Not sure how attractive it is to our native bees, but we have a whole series of native ground cherries. Tea roses are not good. How about regular roses? Probably in your mind, you have a picture of a regular rose that is not good. There are native roses and there are primitive roses. For example, Rosa rugosa, the rose hip, is a good one. But almost all roses that are done for the cut flower trade or for trellises are too messed up, let's call it, to be very good bee plants. But the more primitive ones, so there's a weed rose called multiflora rose, which is an invasive, but it still gets plenty of bees going to it. But wherever you can, you want to get rid of that. Clover, interesting. So there are essentially no native clovers in the area. Clover, though, does attract a lot of bees. It's basically a good nectar source, and it attracts it's like a bird feeder, right? So you put out a bird feeder in the middle of the city, you get lots of birds, but no one's going to say put out bird feeders to save all the bees and all the birds in the area, because you're not supporting flamingos, warblers, tanagers, blackneck stilts or shearwaters, right? When you put out a bird feeder, you're helping birds that don't need your help. You're just attracting them. Clover is in that same area, better than regular grass lawns. So plus there, I would definitely use clover in those circumstances because not many natives that can handle a being trod upon. But clover, as like I have this big area that I want to plant, I would move towards some of our native legumes. So we have native beans and other leguminous. So that's the pea family groups of things. New Jersey tea, awesome plant. Plant as much as you can. Deer love it, so you'll have to be careful about that. More topic, does it make sense to plant such flowers on balcony? Yes. People have studied green roofs, and you have to go up to, I think the answer is 16 stories before bees can't figure out how to get up there. Field guide information on native bees in North America. In North Texas, there's several groups of that. There's the native bee roundup. There's a very active native bee group and society or something. They have yearly meetings or did. In Texas, you'll have to Google them. Do the bee hotel habitat is so commercially good to provide? Yes, but I'm just arguing like, why spend all that money when you could just make it with a drill and occupy some child's time? But they're fine. What do you do if you have a HOA, homeowners association? Well, you have to conform to the homeowners association, but I'm sure the homeowners association is also okay with bedding plants. So you would just put in more formal things, and it depends on the homeowners association. Like maybe at the back of your property where you don't have a lot of people peeping at it, you could do some more of these naturalized environments. It's good to inform them about what's going on. Are vegetable gardens beneficial to bees? Some veggies better than others. In general, so tomatoes, a lot of them require it. So, or have bigger production. So tomatoes, peppers do better when they're visited by pollinators. Squash plants have their own squash bee. So Peponapus pruinosa comes to squash plants early in the morning, and when squash opens. So when squash opens, those flowers close by 9 to, and certainly by noon. Why is that? It's because there's bees that only come out early in the morning to do that pollination. And squash is native to North America. And other garden plants not coming to mind other than the brambles and the fruit trees. The others require some pollination, but mostly to set seed. Other things are more on the self-pollinated end, so think beans, but often get larger seeds and larger growth, beans being a good one, soybeans being an interesting example of that. I came in 30 minutes late. Did you mention any good books or blogs about native bees in your yard? No, there's several. I'm thinking of, there's Wilson and Olivia Mercer, I can't remember Olivia's last name, have, I think it's called maybe even Native Bees in Your Backyard. Great book, good introduction, a little bit Western in proclivity. There's also a really good native plant bee book by a woman in Minnesota that covers our area too. I'm sorry, I'm a little vague on that, on some of these details of books. Rebecca does have bee specialists on them. They're pretty good. So brown-eyed Susan, black-eyed Susan, really useful. They come in quickly, particularly if you're in a naturalized landscape, and they don't last long, but they do provide pollen and nectar. And there's a set of bees, particularly these little sweat bees, that love them. How do you feel about crown bees shipping mason bees for orchard grows? It's tricky. I think in general, they are providing a service. I think it's too small a scale to have really an impact bigger than that. There's some issues in that some of those mason bees are not native to these regions and they're just propagating them around. They're very informative. They are mostly doing doing things well and are responsible, there's just, there's a little bit of issue there, but mostly good job. So, let me just also point out that you don't need to get your bees from crown bees. Like, you simply drill holes in things and put up some, nesting tubes. You will get these osmia. They're everywhere, particularly in suburban environments. So there's no need to buy any kind of bee. You just have to provide the shelters and the flowering plants for them. So let's see, any dangers of
My apologies, Sam, but we are running drastically over the schedule.